Finnian was 72, a retired high school history teacher from a quiet coastal town. His days used to flow with a comforting rhythm, a slow morning coffee by the window, reading old books he'd collected over decades, and evening walks along the pier as the sun dipped into the horizon. But lately, his nights had been different. No matter how tired he felt at bedtime, he found himself waking 2, sometimes 3 times before dawn, shuffling to the bathroom in the dark. At first, he brushed it off as just part of getting older, but as the weeks went on, the restless nights began to weigh heavily on him. One rainy evening, after his 3rd trip to the bathroom in just a few hours, Finnian sat at the edge of his bed, his head resting in his hands. His legs felt heavier, his mind cloudier. The lack of proper sleep made even the simplest tasks during the day harder to manage. He found himself forgetting small things, losing track of where he'd placed his glasses, and even skipping his morning walks. His daughter, worried by how pale he looked one Sunday afternoon, insisted he see the family doctor. That visit changed everything. The doctor listened patiently, then explained that Finnian's nightly bathroom trips, what they call nocturia, weren't just a harmless inconvenience. It was his body's way of signaling something deeper. His bladder muscles were struggling, his kidney function needed attention, and the constant sleep disruption was quietly affecting his heart and memory. The doctor leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm, and said, "Finnian, if we don't get this under control, it could lead to more serious problems than you realize." That night, Finnian couldn't shake the words from his mind. He had always believed health was simply about avoiding sickness, but now he understood it was about protecting the little everyday freedoms, like sleeping through the night, waking up refreshed, and feeling steady on your feet. Losing that felt like losing a piece of himself. The next morning, as the sea breeze drifted through his kitchen window, Finnian made a quiet promise to himself. He would not accept this as an inevitable part of aging. He would do something, even if it meant changing habits he'd held onto for decades. That was when he began his journey, guided by small but powerful changes, the right foods, gentle evening routines, and subtle shifts in how he cared for his body before bed. It wasn't an overnight miracle. The first week, he still woke up once or twice, but his sleep felt a little deeper. The second week, he noticed his morning energy returning. By the end of the month, something remarkable happened. He slept an entire night without a single interruption. The sunrise that morning felt brighter, the air lighter, and for the first time in months, he truly felt like himself again. I'm telling you this not as a story from some medical journal, but as a friend, as someone who has spent decades watching people like Finnian reclaim their nights and their health. In the next few minutes, I'll share with you exactly what helped him. They're simple, natural, and backed by the quiet wisdom of years of practice. And who knows, maybe you too will one day wake up after a full night's rest, wondering why you didn't start sooner. Finnian still remembered the first evening he tried it. The doctor had suggested a few gentle, natural steps to help his body settle before bed, but one in particular caught his attention. "Eat a small handful of fresh cherries in the evening," the doctor had said with a knowing smile. "They carry a natural sleep signal for your body." It sounded almost too simple. After all, cherries were just fruit, something he'd enjoyed during summer picnics decades ago. But the doctor explained that inside those crimson skins was something special, a quiet, gentle messenger that told the body it was time to rest. That night, Finnian placed a small bowl of cherries on the table by the kitchen window. Outside, the sky was painted in gold and rose as the day surrendered to night. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, letting the tart, sweet juice fill his mouth. It was a small, almost ceremonial act, but it felt different, intentional. He wasn't just eating to fill his stomach, he was eating with a purpose, to invite rest back into his life. The first few nights, he didn't notice much change. He still woke once or twice, padding softly down the hallway toward the bathroom. But there was something else, a softness in the way his body felt when he drifted back to bed. His mind wasn't as restless. Sleep returned more quickly. His daughter, visiting one evening, noticed the cherries in the fridge and teased him gently. "Stocking up for a pie, Dad?" she laughed. He smiled, but didn't tell her yet. This was his quiet little experiment. By the end of the first week, he realized he was falling asleep faster. His mind no longer chased thoughts into the early hours. The moon could be high in the sky, the room wrapped in stillness, and he would be resting deeply, his breathing slow and even. He began to wake with fewer aches in his back and a clearer head. The bathroom trips hadn't vanished yet, but his nights no longer felt fractured into 100 pieces. One afternoon, while tending to his small potted herbs by the kitchen, Finnian thought about how strange it was that something so small, a handful of cherries, could begin to shift the course of his nights. He remembered the doctor's words, "Your body listens to the quiet things." It wasn't about forcing sleep, but about teaching his body the language of rest again. As the second week began, he made it a ritual. Dinner would be early, a light meal that didn't weigh him down. Then, an hour before bed, he would pour a cup of warm herbal tea, set his cherries in a small ceramic bowl, and watch the last light fade from the sky. It was a simple, almost old-fashioned habit, but that was part of its magic. For the first time in months, he felt like he was doing something gentle for himself, something his future self would thank him for. One evening, his neighbor Margaret stopped by with a jar of homemade jam. She caught sight of the cherries and raised her eyebrows. "Trying the melatonin trick, are you?" she said knowingly. Finnian chuckled. "Something like that," he replied. They talked a while about old remedies, the things their parents used to swear by, and how often those quiet traditions held more wisdom than modern fixes. That night, Finnian ate his cherries with a little smile, feeling part of something timeless, a thread of simple human care stretching across generations. By the end of the second week, something changed. One night, he woke only once. The next night, not at all. He opened his eyes to the soft gray of dawn, realizing he'd slept straight through. The air felt sharper, fresher, his limbs felt lighter, and deep inside, a small but steady hope began to grow. This was only the first step, but it was a step toward reclaiming his nights, and with them, a piece of himself he thought was gone. The second change came almost by accident. One chilly morning, Finnian was standing in his kitchen, making tea, when he noticed a small bunch of bananas sitting untouched in the fruit bowl. They had been there since his daughter's last visit, slowly ripening into a deeper shade of yellow, speckled with tiny brown freckles. He hadn't given them much thought. To him, bananas were just a quick snack for busy days, not something with the power to change his nights. But the doctor's voice echoed in his mind. "Sometimes, your bladder isn't the only reason you wake up at night. Your muscles need to feel safe enough to rest." That afternoon, during a routine check-in, the doctor had explained it more simply. Magnesium, he said, was like a quiet hand on the shoulder of the nervous system. It calmed muscles, eased tension, and helped the bladder hold itself steady through the night. Without enough of it, muscles could twitch or cramp, waking the body unnecessarily. Bananas, it turned out, were not just a fruit for children's lunchboxes. They were small, gentle carriers of that calming mineral. So that evening, after his now familiar cherry ritual, Finnian peeled a banana. He ate it slowly, noticing the soft, creamy texture and faint sweetness. It wasn't indulgent like a slice of cake or comforting like warm bread, but there was something quietly satisfying about it. He felt fuller without feeling heavy, and when he went to bed later, his body seemed to settle into the mattress a little more easily, like it was finally exhaling after a long day. By the third night, he began to notice something else. The ache in his calves that had been creeping in after evening walks was easing. He no longer woke to the odd, tight pull in his thighs. His legs felt more relaxed under the covers, his toes no longer curling from tiny muscle spasms. It was as if his body had been holding its breath for months and was only now remembering how to let go. One Sunday, his old friend Patrick dropped by for tea. Patrick had been dealing with the same nighttime interruptions, and they found themselves trading small tips over steaming mugs. When Finnian mentioned the bananas, Patrick laughed. "Bananas? You mean the thing I've been ignoring in my kitchen for years?" But when Finnian explained the magnesium connection, Patrick nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe it's time I stop underestimating fruit." It wasn't just the physical change that encouraged Finnian, it was the feeling of control returning. For months, his nights had felt like something happening to him, as if he were a passive passenger in his own body. Now, these small acts, a bowl of cherries, a banana before bed, were like gentle reins, guiding him back toward restful nights. One evening, as he stood in the kitchen peeling his banana, Finnian caught sight of the dark sky outside the window. The moon hung low, and the ocean beyond the pier shimmered faintly. He thought about how simple it all was. No complicated routines, no expensive supplements, just a quiet bowl of fruit and the decision to care for himself in the softest, most human way possible. By the end of the month, he realized something remarkable. His bathroom trips were no longer the anchor dragging his nights into broken pieces. He still woke occasionally, but not with the urgency or frequency that had once defined his nights. and each time he woke, his body felt calm enough to drift easily back into sleep. The gentle strength of those bananas and the minerals they carried had begun weaving themselves into the fabric of his rest. The third change didn't come from the fruit bowl, it came from a simple, steaming mug. One windy afternoon, while browsing the little health shop on Main Street, Finnian noticed a row of herbal teas lined neatly on the shelf. He wasn't much of a tea drinker beyond the occasional black tea in the morning, but something about the soft, earthy scent that drifted from an open sample jar caught his attention. The label read, "Chamomile with lemon balm, naturally calming." He remembered the doctor's words during one of their earlier talks. What you drink in the evening can be a whisper to your body, either inviting it to rest or keeping it on guard. Finnian had never thought much about it before. Coffee was a morning habit, water filled his afternoons, and the occasional glass of wine accompanied dinners with friends. But maybe, he thought, the quiet hour before bed needed its own special drink, something warm, soothing, and purposeful. That night, after dinner, he boiled a small pot of water and dropped in a tea bag of the chamomile blend. The fragrance filled the kitchen, gentle, floral, almost like the breeze that came through the garden in spring. He cradled the mug in both hands, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. Each sip felt like it was drawing the day out of his muscles, untangling the tightness that had settled into his shoulders and lower back. He didn't expect miracles, but that first night, as he slipped into bed, there was a certain softness in his chest, a quiet slowing of thoughts. He still woke once, but when he did, there was no rush in his steps, no frantic urgency. He moved calmly, returned to bed, and fell back into sleep as though nothing had interrupted him at all. Over the next week, this new evening drink became a part of his ritual. Cherries at sunset, a banana a little later, and then, just before turning out the lights, the warm embrace of his chamomile tea. His daughter noticed during a visit. "You're becoming quite the herbalist, Dad," she teased, eyeing the growing collection of tea boxes in the cupboard. He grinned. "Just experimenting," he said, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He was slowly teaching his body how to trust the night again. There was one evening when the wind howled through the streets and rain tapped against the window. Finnian wrapped himself in a wool sweater, poured his tea, and sat by the kitchen window, watching the storm. In the past, nights like these would have been restless, the noise, the damp air, the chill all working against sleep. But that night, the tea warmed him from the inside out, and when he finally went to bed, the storm became a distant lullaby. He began noticing subtle shifts in his days too. Mornings felt less foggy. His steps on his morning walk were steadier, more sure-footed. His patience returned, not just with himself, but with the little frustrations of life. It was as though his body had been quietly craving this pause, this signal of peace at the end of each day. One Sunday, Patrick came by again and found Finnian in the kitchen steeping his tea. "You know," Patrick said, "my wife's been drinking chamomile for years. Swears it's the reason she sleeps like a log." Finnian smiled knowingly. Maybe she's onto something. It was strange, Finnian thought, how such a small ritual could change the tone of his nights. It wasn't about forcing sleep or fighting his body's rhythms. It was about extending an invitation, one his body, weary from years of restless nights, was finally learning to accept. It was Margaret, his next-door neighbor, who first mentioned pumpkin seeds. They were standing by the garden fence one late afternoon, talking about the weather and the slow march toward winter, when she casually remarked, "You know, I used to wake up at night just like you, but a handful of pumpkin seeds before bed, that changed things for me." Finnian raised an eyebrow. Pumpkin seeds? He'd heard they were healthy, but he'd never connected them with better nights. Later that week, during his routine follow-up, he brought it up with his doctor. The doctor nodded approvingly. "They're a quiet friend to your bladder," he said. "Packed with zinc and other minerals that help the muscles and tissues, they stay strong. It's not about making the bladder work harder, it's about helping it work smarter." That evening, Finnian rummaged through the pantry until he found a small bag of raw pumpkin seeds he'd bought months ago, intending to sprinkle them over salads. He poured a small handful into a ceramic dish and carried them to the table. The seeds were simple, earthy, with a pleasant crunch that somehow felt grounding. Unlike heavier snacks, they didn't weigh on his stomach. They were the kind of food you could imagine people eating centuries ago, gathered around a fire, ending the day with something nourishing yet humble. The first few nights, he noticed nothing dramatic, no sudden change in his sleep. But after a week, he began waking up less urgently when nature called. It was as though his bladder was learning patience, holding steady until morning more often than before. His bathroom trips were still there, but quieter, less disruptive. And on the nights when he didn't need to get up at all, he'd wake in the morning feeling almost surprised, as though he'd been given an unexpected gift. One chilly evening, he invited Patrick over for tea. As they talked, Finnian slid the dish of pumpkin seeds toward his friend. "Doctor's orders," he joked. Patrick took a handful, chewing thoughtfully. "Better than those salty peanuts I snack on," Patrick said. They both laughed, but Finnian knew there was truth in it. The seeds weren't just a snack, they were a small, nightly message to his body. "You're supported. You can rest." He began to weave them into his evening routine with quiet satisfaction. The cherries, the banana, the warm chamomile tea, and now the crunchy little seeds that seemed to hum with a steady, calming energy. This wasn't just about adding food to his diet, it was about creating a rhythm, a gentle chain of signals to guide his body toward the night. One Saturday night, after an evening at the local community hall listening to old folk songs, Finnian came home feeling a little tired but peaceful. He poured himself tea, set out his seeds, and sat in the quiet kitchen. The music from the evening still lingered in his ears, but it was fading into the background as his mind and body began to unwind. That night, he slept deeply, the kind of sleep where dreams feel long and the morning feels far away. The next morning, as sunlight spilled across his kitchen table, Finnian realized something important. Each of these changes, from cherries to pumpkin seeds, wasn't meant to be a quick fix. They were gentle nudges, guiding him toward a body that trusted the night again. And as he crunched the last seed from his dish, he smiled at how these small, almost old-fashioned habits were giving him back something priceless. His rest. It was a cool autumn evening when Finnian realized his bedroom might be working against him. He had just finished his nightly tea and seeds, and as he stepped into the room, a wave of warmth hit him. The small radiator in the corner was humming, filling the air with dry heat. He paused for a moment, remembering something his doctor had said weeks earlier. "Sometimes it's not your bladder that wakes you, it's the environment around you." The doctor had explained that for many people, especially as they age, the body is more sensitive to temperature shifts. A room that's too warm or too dry can cause restlessness, making the bladder more reactive. Cool, slightly humid air, on the other hand, tells the body it's safe to sink into deeper sleep. Finnian had always kept the radiator on at night, thinking it was a kindness to his older bones, but now he began to wonder if it was part of the problem. The next evening, he decided to try something different. He turned the radiator down to its lowest setting and cracked open the window just a sliver. The cool night air slipped in gently, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea. He pulled an extra quilt over the bed so he would stay warm without the air becoming stifling. When he lay down, the difference was immediate. The bedding felt fresher, the air lighter in his lungs. That night, he slept more deeply than he had in weeks. Even when he woke briefly to roll over, the air felt so comfortable that he drifted right back into sleep without thinking about the clock or the bathroom. The following morning, he stepped out of bed with an ease that surprised him. The stiffness in his legs was less pronounced, and his mind felt clearer. It was such a simple change, but it had shifted the entire tone of his night. Encouraged, he began refining his sleeping space further. He swapped his heavy curtains for lighter ones that let in just a hint of dawn light, helping him wake more naturally. He placed a small ceramic bowl of water on the radiator to add moisture to the air when he used it. And on especially cold nights, he warmed his feet with a hot water bottle instead of blasting the heat. One evening, Margaret stopped by with a basket of fresh scones. As they chatted over tea, she noticed the cracked window in his bedroom and chuckled. "Finally letting the night air in, are you?" "My grandmother swore by that," Finnian grinned. "She might have been onto something," he replied. The real proof came a few nights later when the town was hit by an unexpected warm spell. Out of habit, Finnian left the radiator off and kept the window slightly open. Even in the mild air, he slept soundly, without the usual middle-of-the-night tossing and turning. It was as though his body had learned to associate the cool, fresh air with safety and rest. Now, each evening as he prepares for bed, Finnian takes a moment to step into his room and breathe in. The air feels like an invitation, a reminder that this space is his sanctuary. And as he settles under the covers, the whisper of the night breeze through the window feels like a quiet friend, watching over his sleep. By now, Finnian's nights were calmer, his sleep deeper, and his mornings brighter. But there was one more change he didn't expect, and it didn't come from the kitchen, the garden, or even his bedroom. It came from inside. For months before these changes, sleep had been a battle. Each trip to the bathroom in the dark felt like proof that his body was failing him. He would lie in bed afterward, tense and frustrated, silently counting the hours left until morning. The more he worried about it, the more his body seemed to rebel. His doctor had once mentioned, "Your mind can be just as noisy as your bladder at night. Calm one and the other often follows." At the time, Finnian had brushed it off, but now, as he reflected on his journey, he could see the truth in those words. One evening, after his tea and cherries, he decided to try something new. Instead of climbing straight into bed with his mind full of the day's little worries, he sat quietly in his armchair by the window. He closed his eyes and listened to the soft hum of the evening, the wind moving gently through the trees, the occasional call of a night bird. His breathing slowed without him forcing it, and the tight knot in his shoulders loosened. For the first time in a long while, he let go of the pressure to sleep well and simply allowed himself to rest. This became his new ritual. Just 10 quiet minutes each night, not reading, not watching television, not scrolling through his phone, just being. Sometimes he thought of nothing. Sometimes he remembered the faces of loved ones. Other times he simply listened to his own breath. And on the nights when he did wake to use the bathroom, he no longer let frustration follow him back to bed. He would take a slow breath, remind himself that this was normal, and slip back into sleep without turning it into a struggle. One Saturday morning, Patrick dropped by with fresh bread from the bakery. Over coffee, Finnian told him about his new practice. Patrick smirked. "So, you're meditating now?" Finnian chuckled. "If you want to call it that. I just think of it as getting out of my own way." Patrick nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the real trick. Not forcing the night to behave, but inviting it in." As the weeks passed, this shift in perspective seemed to deepen the benefits of everything else he had been doing. The cherries, the bananas, the pumpkin seeds, the chamomile tea, the cooler bedroom, they all worked better now that his mind was no longer in constant combat with the night. It was as though his body and mind had finally agreed to work together again. One evening, he stood at the window watching the last light fade from the horizon. He thought about how far he'd come, from those restless, broken nights to this quiet, steady peace. Sleep was no longer an enemy to chase or a prize to earn. It was simply a friend who arrived when welcomed. And with that realization, Finnian knew his journey wasn't just about sleeping through the night. It was about reclaiming trust in his own body and learning that sometimes the gentlest shifts, both in habits and in heart, can bring the deepest rest. The change that came next surprised Finnian because it didn't happen in the evening at all. It began in the cool, pale light of morning. For years, his mornings had been slow and quiet, coffee by the kitchen window, maybe a short read of the newspaper, and then the rest of the day unfolding at its own unhurried pace. But his doctor had mentioned something that stuck with him. How you treat your body in the morning decides how it rests at night. At first, Finnian didn't understand. He thought sleep was all about what happened in the hours before bed. But the doctor explained that gentle morning activity, especially in natural light, helps the body set its internal clock, telling it exactly when to wake and when to rest. Without that signal, the body's rhythm can drift, leaving sleep scattered and shallow. One breezy morning, Finnian decided to try it. Instead of sipping coffee indoors, he took it outside. The air was crisp, the sun still low, and the quiet streets were painted in soft gold. He walked slowly toward the pier, his hands wrapped around the warm mug, the sound of gulls overhead like distant bells. The sunlight touched his face, and something deep inside seemed to respond, a small lift in his mood, a subtle spark of energy. He kept it simple. 10 minutes at first, then 15. By the second week, he was walking down to the pier every morning, watching the fishing boats ease out into the water. He found that the movement loosened his legs, making them feel less stiff during the day. His breathing deepened, his steps grew steadier. And at night, he began to notice something unexpected. His body seemed more ready to rest, as if the day had a natural closing point. Patrick noticed the change one afternoon when they bumped into each other at the market. "You're looking fresher these days," Patrick remarked. Finnian smiled. "Just letting the morning light do its work," he replied. Patrick shook his head with a grin. And here I thought coffee was the secret. The morning walks soon became more than a sleep remedy. They became a quiet pleasure in their own right. Finnian began greeting familiar faces along the way, the baker unlocking his shop, the postman making his rounds, the woman in the red scarf who walked her dog at the same time each day. These brief connections stitched him a little more tightly into the fabric of the town, adding a sense of belonging that warmed him long after the walk was over. And perhaps, most importantly, the walks gave him a feeling of ownership over his days again. Instead of letting the night's challenges set the tone, he started each morning with something that grounded him, body and mind. Sleep, he realized, wasn't just about the hours in bed, it was about how he lived the hours outside of it. And with every sunrise he met face to face, his nights seemed to thank him a little more. The idea for the next change came not from his doctor, but from Margaret. One afternoon, she stopped by with a jar of her famous plum jam and found Finnian kneeling awkwardly in the garden, trying to coax a stubborn weed out of the soil. "You move like your hips are made of rusty hinges," she teased. He laughed, but knew she was right. His hips felt stiff most mornings, and his lower back often ached by evening. Margaret, who had taken up yoga at the community center, told him that gentle stretching, especially for the hips and lower back, could work wonders for circulation and even help the bladder work more comfortably. Finnian was skeptical at first. Yoga was something he associated with people half his age, bending into impossible shapes. But Margaret insisted it didn't have to be complicated. She showed him one simple move, lying on his back and gently pulling one knee toward his chest, holding it there for a few slow breaths before switching sides. "It's not about showing off," she said. "It's about giving your body room to breathe." That evening, after his tea, cherries, and seeds, Finnian decided to try. He lay on the living room carpet, pulled one knee toward his chest, and felt a slow, stretching release in his lower back. His breathing deepened without him forcing it. He switched legs, feeling the same quiet opening in his hips. It wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniably good. His body felt less locked up, less held in by invisible tension. He began adding a few minutes of stretching before bed each night. Some nights it was just the knee-to-chest pose. Other nights he tried gently leaning forward while sitting on the floor, feeling the soft pull in the back of his legs. He never pushed himself. That wasn't the point. The point was to send his body a signal. "You're safe now, you can rest." Within a week, he began noticing small changes. He could bend to tie his shoes without the familiar tight pull across his lower back. Getting in and out of bed felt easier. And most surprising of all, he felt less pressure in his bladder at night. The doctor later explained that when the muscles in the pelvis and hips are tight, they can subtly irritate the bladder. Loosening them before bed can make a quiet but meaningful difference. Patrick, curious as ever, asked about the new habit over tea one morning. Finnian laughed. "Never thought I'd be the type to stretch on purpose," he admitted. Patrick raised an eyebrow. "If it keeps you from pacing to the bathroom all night, maybe I should try it too." One night, after a particularly satisfying round of stretching, Finnian slipped into bed and noticed how light his body felt against the mattress. The muscles that had once carried the day's tension into the night were finally letting go. He drifted off without the usual fidgeting, without waiting for his body to find its place. And as the days passed, he realized the stretching wasn't just helping his nights, it was making his days easier too. Walking felt smoother, gardening less tiring, even climbing the stairs was less of a chore. It was another small but powerful reminder that the line between night and day was thinner than he'd ever realized, and what he did before bed could echo into every waking hour. It wasn't all about adding new habits. Some changes came from letting go, and this one, Finnian realized, had been quietly sabotaging his nights for years. For as long as he could remember, he had enjoyed a small cup of coffee after dinner. It was a ritual left over from his teaching days, when marking papers or preparing lessons often stretched late into the night. Even after retirement, he kept it. That warm, rich bitterness felt like a reward at the end of the day. He had always believed coffee didn't really affect him anymore. After all, he could still fall asleep most nights. But one afternoon, while leafing through a health magazine at the cafe, he came across an article about caffeine. It wasn't just about keeping you awake, it said. Caffeine could also irritate the bladder and increase the urge to urinate, even hours after drinking it. Finnian set the magazine down slowly, thinking about his nightly bathroom trips. Could that harmless little cup be part of the problem? That evening, instead of coffee, he made himself a mug of warm chamomile tea. It felt strange, like a break in tradition. He missed the smell, the familiar comfort of holding his coffee cup, but the tea had its own kind of warmth, softer and more forgiving. He sipped it slowly, telling himself it was just an experiment. The difference wasn't instant, but it was noticeable. Over the next few nights, the sharp urgency that sometimes jolted him awake seemed to soften. When he did wake, it felt less pressing, easier to ignore until morning. His bladder wasn't the only one grateful, his mind was quieter too. Without that invisible caffeine edge humming in the background, he settled into sleep more gently. One Friday evening, Patrick came over for a game of cards. Patrick reached for the coffee pot out of habit, but Finnian stopped him with a grin. "Tea tonight," he said. Patrick laughed, shaking his head. "You've changed, Finn," Finnian smiled back. "For the better." Breaking the coffee habit wasn't just about the caffeine, it was about letting go of the idea that he needed a certain thing to end the day. Instead, he began to see his evenings as a time for unwinding, not for squeezing in one last burst of energy. And with that shift, his nights became calmer, his bladder less insistent, and his mornings, to his quiet delight, clearer than they had been in years. One evening, as he sat with his tea by the open window, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the night air, Finnian realized something important. Sometimes the hardest habit to change is the one you've carried the longest. But when you finally set it down, the relief can feel like lifting a stone from your chest. And in that lightness, sleep comes easier, almost as if it's been waiting for you to make space for it all along. By now, Finnian's nights were steadier than they had been in years. The cherries, bananas, pumpkin seeds, tea, stretches, and cooler bedroom had all done their part. But he still sensed there was one final thread missing, something to tie the whole evening together. It wasn't another food, drink, or exercise. It was about creating a moment that told his mind and body, "The day is done. You can let go now." He remembered how, as a boy, his mother would close the day in small, familiar ways, turning down the lamp, drawing the curtains, smoothing the quilt over his bed. Those small gestures told him, even before his head touched the pillow, that it was safe to rest. He decided to make something like that for himself now. One evening, after his tea, he lit a single candle on the kitchen table. The soft glow reached out into the corners of the room, warming them in a way electric light never could. He sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the flame flicker. He thought about the day, not the tasks he hadn't finished, but the little moments he'd enjoyed. The gulls calling over the pier, the smell of fresh bread at the bakery, the laughter from a passing group of children. After blowing out the candle, he would walk slowly through his home, dimming lights, checking windows, folding back the quilt. This became his signal, his way of stepping into a quieter world. By the time he slipped into bed, his mind had already shifted gears, drifting away from the noise of the day. The difference was subtle but powerful. His sleep felt deeper, less interrupted. Even on nights when he did wake, it was easier to return to that stillness. He no longer lay in bed wrestling with thoughts or straining to force himself back to sleep. The ritual had done the work for him, softening the edges of his mind so the night could flow in naturally. Patrick noticed the change one morning when they met at the market. "You've got that rested look," he said. Finnian grinned. "Just closing the day properly," he replied. Margaret, hearing this, later told him, "That's what we all forget. We rush right into bed, but we never tell our bodies it's time to rest." This small ritual became something he looked forward to each evening. It wasn't just about sleep, it was about honoring the day, no matter how ordinary. In the quiet between the candlelight and the quilt, he felt connected to the life he was living. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded him that good nights are rarely accidents. They're built gently and patiently from the smallest of moments. Finnian's journey began with restless nights, endless trips to the bathroom, and the quiet frustration of believing this was simply the cost of getting older. But over time, he discovered that small, deliberate changes could weave together into something far greater than he imagined. Cherries at sunset, a warm mug of chamomile, the crunch of pumpkin seeds, cooler bedroom air. Each habit became a thread, and together they formed a blanket of steady, restorative rest. The transformation wasn't just in his sleep, it was in the way he lived his days. Morning walks under the golden light gave him energy and balance. Gentle stretches loosened tension he didn't know he was carrying. Letting go of evening coffee brought his nights a quiet calm he hadn't felt in years. And perhaps most importantly, the simple act of closing the day with a quiet ritual, candlelight, reflection, stillness, reminded him that rest is something we invite, not demand. His story isn't about quick fixes or overnight miracles. It's about listening, to the body's small signals, to the wisdom in daily rhythms, to the possibility that change can come softly without fanfare. If you've been carrying restless nights as a quiet burden, maybe it's time to believe that your own small steps can add up too. Tonight, when the day slows and the world softens, choose one gentle act for yourself. Not because you have to, but because you deserve to sleep without struggle, to wake with a clear mind and light heart. And as Finnian now knows, the night is not something to be endured. It's a gift waiting to be welcomed. May yours come quietly, deeply, and with the peace you've been hoping for.